Father in heaven, thank you for this sunshine. Thank you that we have sunshine, Lord, on the day of preparation, that things can be set up in a little bit more simply and with comfort. And I pray that you'll bless this day as we have studies and as we fellowship, and also as we prepare for your Sabbath. I pray, Lord, that we'll understand what's being presented and that we can come into common understanding. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, quick recap of yesterday, because we finished quite quickly. We compared and contrasted modern Israel and modern Babylon, and we saw how Satan is counterfeiting the Alpha and the Omega histories of modern Israel. We saw that after a time period of scattering, 1798, William Miller begins an increase of knowledge. 1819, Eugenio Pacelli became an increase of knowledge. 1816 to 1818, we mark that waymark where it really, he has everything in a capsule form. May 13 of 1917, we mark particularly both Fatima and Pacelli. You can mark both of them on this date, Lucia and Pacelli. And I want to also note that we mark Lucia in this history. And she continues to have visions and apparitions, the Catholic version, for decades after this, until close to her death. So you have this 46-year history. It's restructuring the Catholic Church, and this is also, you could say, repairing the temple. 1917, he goes to Germany to begin that work. 1833, it's William Miller formalizes his message. He receives his credentials, and also believe there was a document written in that year summarizing that. 1933, it's the Code of Canon Law signed by Adolf Hitler, and that's formalized a union between Nazi Germany and the papacy, which they need to fulfill Fatima, which is now accepted, the second secret, the first work to take down the Soviet Union. That ends in disappointment, 1844, 1945. There's a time period of scattering, a very dark period for Adventism, a very dark period for the Catholic Church as communism sweeps across Eastern Europe. November 1, 1850, they're given the call to make a new chart, and Ellen White tells the people that God is regathering his people. November 1, 1950, he comes out to an audience of about 1 million strong crowd, the dogma of the Assumption of Mary, and he starts resurrecting the messages of Fatima. 1954, he dedicates the entire year to Mary and Fatima and organises massive pilgrimages to Portugal. All of that attempted gathering ends in failure. He dies. 1863, organisation occurs. 1962, organisation occurs. They rejected the prophetic message, the 2520. They rejected the prophetic message, the second secret of Fatima, communism. 1886, you see this conflict, civil war internally between the leadership and a new branch that is bringing in revolutionary modern ideas. This is Butler versus Wagner. You can also see it as Jones versus Smith. Both sides were half right and half wrong. 1987, Malachi Martin on the side of John Paul II is attacking the Jesuits. You have the leadership and a radical group of people bringing in modern, radically new teachings into the Catholic Church. 1888, they're half right and they're half wrong. 1989, I would suggest they're half right and they're half wrong because it's the work of the Jesuits. Not necessarily in the secret society way, definitely not in the secret society way that Walter Wyeth portrays, but it's still the work of the Jesuits. They begin work to overturn the leadership, the St. Galen group, or St. Galen Mafia as they call themselves. But that work begins when they find Bergoglio. He's made a cardinal. 2001, it takes them a period of time till 2013. And from then on till now, you have civil war inside the Catholic Church. We understand that in our reform line, and Elder Jeff taught this in early April in Arkansas. He said there's a transition in leadership from Elder Jeff to Elder Parminder. And we find ourselves at a time period in history where we have two leaders. One has stepped down and thrown the mantle. It's been 1,000 years, give and take maybe 10 or 20 years, 1,000 years since you've had two popes standing at the same time, where one has thrown the mantle but still lives. Pope Francis, 2013 he becomes Pope, particularly 2014, he begins to change the teaching of the Catholic Church. 2014's July 21, it's when you mark Samuel Snow on the second leadership internally as well. So 1,000 years since you've had two living popes where one has thrown the mantle. In early April, former Pope Benedict broke his silence and he issued a letter about the sexual abuse scandal in the Catholic Church. And what did he say in that letter? The abuse happened because of what? All of this Second Vatican nonsense, all of this liberalism that's come in, all of the liberal 60s movement that brought in all this immorality and perversion. That's why there's a sexual abuse issue inside the Catholic Church. Is he on this side of the issue or on this side of the issue? This is John Paul II's conservative teaching. He's attacking the Jesuit teaching of the Second Vatican Council. So in this letter, early April, Pope Benedict, the first time you've had a former pope in 1,000 years, still alive, breaks his silence for the first time in years and attacks his successor. He does two things. First of all, he endorses him. He says, I'm 100% behind Pope Francis, and then what does he do? And then he undermines his whole message. Early April, what did Elder Jeff do? 100% behind Elder Parminder, and then what did he do? Completely undermined his message of 2012 and the Midnight Cry, which I think was a blessing. 2012, the message of time.
Okay.
I just want us to see how that's paralleled. It's the first time in 1,000 years you've even had two living. And then you can connect them to the month, the internal and the external. That's an application. Pope Francis is Elder Jeff, not Pope Benedict. But we can take a snapshot of application and see that there's two. But it's Pope Francis from the beginning of their time of the end. So Pope Francis represents two people. I do think that's a blessing, because unless Elder Jeff hadn't have done that, we wouldn't have gone through this study and made it and tried to grapple with why that's not the case. Why we're not in a history of failure, and therefore why the message of 2012 is not half right and half wrong. So we laid that out. And then we went to these histories and we saw that there's two histories of failure and then a history of success. And we already did that with the King of the South. How many battles between the King of the North and the King of the South? 3. The first one, they're allies. They have 3 battles. And for the King of the North, what are the first 2? In a history of success for the King of the North, what are the first 2? You have the same pattern: failure, failure, success. It's failure, failure, and success. So when we take 1844 and their disappointment, that experience, and we take 1888 and the disappointment and that experience, we can't bring that into our history at our close of probation and expect a disappointment of that nature. And we see the same thing with ancient Israel. We have Moses, they're coming out of Egypt. That ended in apostasy. You have the history of the captivity of Babylon. That ended in Pharisees. You come to the captivity to Rome. Was that failure or success? Complete success. The message was perfect. They were told exactly where they were in history and what was going to happen. They had no reason to doubt, except as they didn't listen. And except as they did what? What did Brother Tyler teach us yesterday? What was Judas's problem?
Both streams.
He wanted both streams of information. Do we think it's safe to just, okay, we're going to listen to Christ a lot, because what did Judas do? How closely did he follow Christ? Very closely, day after day after day. How much did he need of the false stream to get it wrong? You only need a little. You only need to go back to that church, to go back to the synagogue just a little to get that whole history wrong. What about the other disciples that ran away? What was their problem? Who were they listening to? They didn't need to listen to the Pharisees. Who they're listening to?
Their expectations in the Old Testament.
They're listening to Judas. It's Judas that undermines the words of Christ. So is that external or internal to the movement? That's internal. And there's internal Judases saying, no, you can listen to both streams of information. It's safe to take a little. Is it safe to take a little of the Ula and a little of the Hiddekel? Is that anything new that we should know? That's 1996 material. So if they want to successfully navigate this history, there's only one safe stream of information. And that's one methodology, and one messenger. So this history is a history of success, and it parallels the line of the 144,000. We finished with this compare and contrast of modern Israel and modern Babylon. I'm going to rub this out now, and I want us to look at the battles with the king of the south. I want us to give some context to what we're looking at before we start making prophetic application of battles. Before we do that, I want us to consider some of the global conflicts that we find. It would be really neat to go through the histories of Pyrrhus, and I think we could demonstrate that more clearly, what I want to say, but it's been something that we've been repetitively seeing and teaching, is that what are they fighting over? What's the conflict over? Spheres of influence. If you were to go to Daniel 11, what's the story of Daniel 11, verse 4 to 15? You have Ptolemy and Ptolemy down in Egypt. You have Seleucus up in Babylon. Is Seleucus trying to take Egypt? In verses 4 to 15.
No.
Is Ptolemy trying to take Babylon? What do they both want? They both want this area of Coal Syria. We see this witness time and time again. And those verses of Daniel 11 are some of the strongest witnesses that we have to, are some of the strongest verses that we have to show us where we are in history. And what are they fighting over? Spheres of influence. It's this area of cold Syria. So does Seleucus ever take Egypt? No. No, not all the way past Panium does Seleucus ever take Egypt. He doesn't need to. The whole conflict is over spheres of influence. So I just want us to consider a little of how we see the world. We're going to begin with what probably many of you are familiar with, but some of you aren't, so we're going to revise it anyway and just look at Syria, the conflict in Syria, the civil war. And I can't draw, so I think you would rather Brother Tyler's blocks, but we'll try and make this work. Up here we have Turkey. We have Syria. We have Saudi Arabia. And we have this area, the Persian Gulf. Is there another pen? Because I do think this one will run out. It'll go a little longer. So we have the Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia. This area kind of in here, Iraq. Down here you have all kinds of problems. Israel, Palestine, Lebanon. Iran. And down here you have this little nation of Qatar. And I know that's not all correct to scale, but that's kind of the rough breakdown of the region. And here we have the Mediterranean Sea. What gives Russia so much leverage over Europe? Thank you.
Is it Syria and Iraq or Iran with that? Syria and Iraq.
Sorry?
So,
What,
resources, gas.
so separate to everything here, what gives Russia leverage over Europe? It's the gas market. So Russia supplies one quarter, 25% of Europe's natural gas. And how is it transported? Through pipelines, established pipelines. And when Russia has problems with Ukraine or with Georgia, what do they do in the dead of winter? They shut off the gas. They use it as political leverage. So in 2014, what did Obama say? It's a bit late, but it's been their mentality for a long time. They need to bypass Russia and find a way to get more gas into Europe. It's in those kinds of, it's just one issue, I know, but it's a major issue. And Obama spoke of it in 2014, that to restrain Russia, they needed to find a way to pipe gas into Europe. The problem with the Persian Gulf is it is so rich in natural gas, but what's the problem? It all has to be put on tanker ships and transported, and that's an expensive operation, and when it costs more, Europe's just going to get it from Russia. So what they need is pipelines to take the natural gas from the Persian Gulf into Europe. In 2009, Qatar has access to a serious quantity of this natural gas. And Qatar is hopeful that it can build a pipeline from the Persian Gulf into Europe, and it'll bypass Russia in the gas market. Where can they go? Where can they build that pipeline? The only option Qatar has is to go through Saudi Arabia, through Syria, through Turkey. That was the only viable option they had. So if we were to consider how the world operates, we could talk about the United States and Russia. Where is Turkey as far as the United States and Russia go? What side? This is a simple version. There's countries that feel bold enough to play both sides. But the majority of time, Turkey's quite happy following the United States. Qatar. Completely United States. I think Qatar has the largest American military base in the Middle East. So Turkey's okay, Qatar is okay, Saudi Arabia. US. Where's the problem? So what does Assad think about this pipeline? Saudi Arabia says yes, Turkey says yes. Who says no? Syria says no. It's 2009. Early 2011, Iran has access to natural gas. Not as much as Qatar, but some. And they decide they want to build a pipeline into Europe. Where are they going to go?
Syria.
The only option they have is it has to go through Iraq and it has to go through Syria. They don't want to go through Turkey. They think they can go under the Mediterranean and come out, I think, in Greece. Now what does Syria say? Early 2011.
Yes.
Why? Because Iran, who do they come under?
Russia.
So Syria says yes to Iran pumping gas into Europe and no to Qatar because Syria is on this side of the issue. So that's early 2011. Later 2011, what happens? Arab Spring. That's why this pipeline is never built. It's never built because of the civil war in Syria. And what began as a civil war has now been for 8 years a proxy war. A proxy war but between the United States and Russia. And why is it a proxy war? Because whoever controls Syria is going to control how the resources of the Persian Gulf find their way into Europe. Becomes a seriously significant area when it relates to the resources of the Middle East. This is the entryway. You can't trust the conflict in Israel and Palestine. This is too volatile a region. It has to go through Syria. This is why it's been a proxy war for 8 years. Nothing else that happened in Arab Spring lasted 8 years. Dictators were overthrown or dictators put down rebellions. Most of them just put down the rebellion. But they're all finished really quickly. In Syria, every single time Assad looks like he's falling, what does Russia do? Send in planes and just mass bombs all of his enemies. And every single time Assad looks strong and it looks like the rebels are losing, what does the United States do? Send in the airplanes and just bomb Assad. So who's suffering?
Syria.
The people. So this is the conflict in Syria. Where is the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world today? Where is that? No. By far the greatest humanitarian crisis. It's been that way for a couple of years. 14 million people. On the brink of starvation, on the brink of death. 10 million people actively starving to death. Where are they? Where's 10 million people starving to death? No.
Oh, it's in the Middle East. Yemen.
It's Yemen. It's down here, it's Yemen. 10 million people, many of them little children, starving to death. Why? What's the conflict in Yemen about? There's two factions, the government and the rebels, again. But why is it going on for years, leading to 10 million people starving to death? It's a proxy war. Between who? Between these two. This Middle Eastern area, it's oversimplifying it a little, I know, but it's still accurate to say it's divided between two superpowers internally, Iran and Saudi Arabia, and they're backing opposite sides in a civil war in Yemen. So this whole conflict is between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Yemen itself is a proxy war. Just shortly before Obama left office, he was told, oh, by the way, who's supporting Saudi Arabia in this proxy war? The United States. Every time Saudi Arabia goes to bomb Yemen, and by the way, they're bombing hospitals, schools, everything. If you want to watch the videos of what a hospital looks like after Saudi Arabia's bombed it, you can go and see them on the New York Times. They're trying to cover that issue. So Saudi Arabia sends its planes in to bomb Yemen. American planes, those big ones that refuel the bombers mid-air, the American planes leave from Syria, they meet down in Saudi Arabia, they refuel all of Saudi Arabia's planes, and those planes go on and bomb Yemen. The weapons Saudi Arabia is using, who supplies them? The US. And the Saudi Arabia is known to be conducting war crimes in Yemen. And officials from the UN went to Obama and they said, if you don't put a stop to the support that's going to Saudi Arabia over Yemen, the United States itself is going to be charged with war crimes. And Obama started to bring in legislation and pull back from supporting Saudi Arabia. Trump's just upended all of that. First of all, he said, you can't charge the United States with war crimes. You can't even investigate us. And the second thing he did is scrap all of the restrictions that Obama had put in place about what weapons they could sell to Saudi Arabia. And he's about to arm them a whole lot more than Obama ever did. But this is the conflict in Yemen. And there's a story in the news this week about a ship that rescued off the coast of Europe. And in the Mediterranean Sea, they rescued all of these refugees from Yemen, and they're trying to find a European country that will take them. And can they find one? No. No. Why?
Conspiracy. They're not playing on our side.
No. Because they just don't care. Because we look at these conflicts and say, why don't, they're just troublemakers. Why can't they sort out their own government? We can't fix the problem. That's their problem. Is it their problem? No. None of it's their problem. This proxy war in Syria would have been over with within the year. This conflict in Yemen would have been over with within the year, and maybe they'd have a dictatorship, but 10 million people wouldn't be starving. The West holds the responsibility for those refugees, and then they don't want to take the consequences of their own actions. It's not unless we start to see, we need to see the external events so we can begin to have some empathy. And this is what the left wants to cover. And what does the right want to say? Not our problem. America first, Germany first, France first, Canada first. And meanwhile, they're fueling this conflict. And I want us to just consider why. When we talked about slavery, what was the issue?
Interpretation of the Constitution.
That's one of them. I'm thinking of one particular one Brother Tyler mentioned yesterday. Why did the Civil War and the issue of slavery, 100 years later, why do you then have the Civil Rights Movement? Why did you have to have a Civil Rights Movement?
Racism still existed.
The problem never ended. So I want us to consider, we've talked about Syria, we've talked about Yemen. Let's talk about the Arctic. The Arctic used to look like this. What does it look like now? Assuming we're all unlearning our conspiracy theories, what does it look like now? It looks like that. And when the Arctic goes from looking like this to looking like this, what happens?
Water level goes up. It's warm.
That's one of them.
Competition of land. Who owns it?
Why do all the countries now want access to the Arctic? Resources. Some of the richest resource land in the world. So when the conspiracy theorists say global warming is something used to, because there's corporations behind it, they're going to make millions of dollars for it, where is the money? Is it in stopping global warming or encouraging it? No, if you're a Trump and you want to make America great again, you do not want to stop global warming. You don't even want to listen to that side of the story because the amount of resources that are opening up in the Arctic. And this has turned, all of this area has turned into, without the countries or the people to suffer for it, but there's going to be global consequences with the environment. What has all of this area and resources turned into? It's a proxy war. Now there's a proxy war over the Arctic. And why?
Because the Arctic is a problem with water right now. No, it's not. It's the Arctic.
This is the Arctic.
Isn't it the Antarctic they also want to mine water?
I think they would want both,
No.
but I think it's particularly that the conflict's particularly over the Arctic.
With Russia,
Not just Russia, all the countries, but Russia's got in early. They even got a Russian flag on one of those submersible little submarines and planted a metal Russian flag beneath the Arctic. They're not hiding it. They already have troops there preparing for conflict. They'll fight for this, actively fight for this. It was the president of Iceland, what did he say? He thinks this is wonderful because Iceland has access to some of these, so he's gleeful. This is great for his country. And what did he say about the Arctic? He's so excited about it. Look what we can access. Forget about global warming and the environment. This is so good for us. And what did he say this was? He said, how wonderful, that's my paraphrase, to quote him, the Arctic is the new Africa. And he meant that positively. What hasn't changed? Imperialism. We look back and we see the damage that imperialism did to Africa, to all of those countries. Back when you had, Britain is imperialistic and France is imperialistic, all those imperial colonies. It's the same issue that we have with slavery. That mindset never changed. They just had to change how they went about it. Imperialism is the same. It never changed. They've moved on from Africa and now it's the Arctic. And they've already said that. Now they're acting imperialistic over the Arctic. And there aren't so many people suffering, but you can see the environment's going to. And now what's the Middle East? It's the new Africa. And who's suffering? And who wants to take them in, help them when they are? No one. The drug war in Central America. How many gun stores are in Mexico? One. In the whole of Mexico, there's one store selling guns. Where do the guns come from that fuel the gun violence and the drug violence in Central America? They come from the United States. Many of them. So, the United States wants to stop the immigrants fleeing the drugs and the gun violence. They want to stop the drugs coming in. Where should they start? Reason from cause to effect. If you want to stop the refugees, what do? Reason from cause to effect. If you want to stop global warming, you reason from cause to effect. And that is what the left does that the right doesn't. Because to reason from cause to effect would put responsibility back on who it belongs to. And Donald Trump does not want to take responsibility. I want us to see where the conflict is over. Not just the different mentalities behind them, but what this war is over. Yemen is between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but who supports Yemen? So who supports Saudi Arabia? The United States. And who supports Iran? Russia. You can, understanding countries still have problems with each other, but you can divide the world into two global superpowers and two spheres of influence. And what these countries are fighting over, the United States and Russia, just like in Daniel 11, the king of the north and the king of the south, isn't for control of the United States or Russia. It's control over the Arctic and Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf and Syria. That's what they want control over, because that is what makes a power a superpower. And in 1989, what did the Soviet Union begin to lose? Territory, spheres of influence. They began to lose Eastern Europe, not Russia, because Russia isn't what the United States wanted. So at Panium, what did they lose? Influence. We haven't talked about Afghanistan, but you can see the same thing. It's also a current proxy war. It was a current proxy war. It was a proxy war before 1989, and it's a proxy war again today. The United States and Russia are still supporting opposite sides in Afghanistan. Ukraine. You could put all of these countries on one of these two sides. Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin met for the second official time. The first time was last year in Helsinki. The second time was, I think, yesterday in Japan, I think. And what did they say they talked over? Ukraine, Afghanistan, Syria. They just listed the countries. That's what they were talking about. That's what they need to sort out between themselves. So when we look through the battles of Pyrrhus, we took Pyrrhus and these battles, and we saw to conflate the two lines and to bring Alpha and Omega together. It makes it a little bit more simple to do it this way. It begins previously with an alliance, and then at Ipsus they're allies, the king of the north and the king of the south. And then you have three battles: Heraclea, Asculum, and Beneventum. At the Battle of Heraclea, who comes against who? It's the king of the north that comes against the king of the south, and who wins? The king of the south. When we brought that to our reform line, we recognised through combining our histories that this alliance was 2014. And we were able to do that because we pinned it to the war in Ukraine. We looked at Thuri, we saw that Thuri turned again to Rome, and when it turned to the king of the north, it was invaded by Tarentum. Tarentum's the king of the south. Thuri, we'd already connected that back to its early history as being specifically Ukraine. And if you're going to mark an invasion by the king of the south into a previous sphere of influence, it's 2014 and the conflict over Ukraine. And then we see 2016. Ipsus. And in this history, the king of the north and the king of the south, they're fighting together. Ideological enemies. It's unexpected, but they're fighting on the same side. Heraclea. It's all broken down. The king of the north attacks the king of the south. The king of the south wins. If we'll bring this into the history of World War II, we'd have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And then the invasion of Poland. The invasion of Poland, are Hitler and Stalin in an alliance or opposed? Without an alliance with the Soviet Union, Hitler would never have invaded Poland. It would have been suicide. Why? What's Hitler's background?
The First World War he experienced.
So Hitler's a soldier in World War I. This is Germany. What problem does Germany face? What disadvantage does Germany face compared to all the other countries? Geography. It's got this issue with geography. So France doesn't face this, or Britain or Russia. The problem that Germany faces is that they're surrounded by enemies. So in World War I, there's a war on two fronts. Two fronts for who? Germany. So when you have Russia coming from the east, and you have Britain and France and the United States coming from the west, in World War I, how much did this disadvantage Germany? It was a massive disadvantage, and Hitler was a soldier during that war. He knows it too well. So when he wants to invade Poland, and Britain and France have told him, if you invade Poland, we're going to attack you, what does Hitler have to do in his mind to make sure that this isn't a suicide mission? He needs to have peace with the Soviet Union. He has to know that he can safely focus on the Western Front before facing a war on both fronts. Best case scenario, completely conquer the West and then turn towards the East. But he begins World War II this exact same way they begin World War I, he knows it's going to end the same as World War I. So there's three parts to this pact that Hitler has to have before he begins. One is non-aggression. It's a promise that when Hitler is at war with the West, Stalin isn't going to take advantage of that conflict and invade from the East. So first of all, they sign a non-aggression pact, a promise that they won't go to war while this other war is going on. What's the second part of this pact?
Support.
What type of support?
Minerals.
Resources. I want to put that as the third because it's actually a separate pact to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, made around a similar time. It's resources. It's the economic agreement by which Germany was to pay for the resources that the Soviet Union could supply to them, because Germany is also going to find its trade routes all cut off by blockades. They need to be able to get resources from the Soviet Union and also through Soviet Union railways. The second part of this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is what? Sorry? Yes. Spheres of influence. They're going to take a map and start cutting up all the countries between them, saying, if you take this, I'll take this. I can offer you this. Maybe we just halve this country down the middle. They pretty much just cut their way through Eastern Europe and divide it between themselves. So this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is these two parts. It's non-aggression and spheres of influence. Around the same time, what Hitler needs just as much to engage war on the Western Front is access to resources. They don't have nearly enough resources to conduct a war. They actually calculated the resources Germany had access to, and when Germany invades the Soviet Union at Operation Barbarossa, how long would that invasion have lasted if Hitler hadn't have already taken in resources from the Soviet Union?
And where did they get their finance?
It wasn't just money. It was German inventions, plans for battleships, technology. It was really Germany was the most civilized, one of the most advanced societies in the world. So they had plans for the Bismarck, all those, and we'll discuss how they try and withhold all those plans. But it was more than money. It was German invention that they were to pay with. How long would that invasion have lasted? It's been estimated less than 1 day. That's how much Hitler needed a trade route open with the Soviet Union. So, first of all the pact, then the invasion of Poland, and they're in an alliance here. And then we come to August of 1940, and what happens in August of 1940? Their relationship breaks down for the course of a month. So in August of 1940, this relationship just breaks down, and the Soviet Union stops sending any of these resources through to Hitler. They've had a breakdown in their relationship between these two issues. The spheres of influence, they're having disagreements about the spheres of influence, and they're also disagreeing over Germany's payment to the Soviet Union, the fact that they're not paying. And when they are paying, like sending plans for I think that like the Bismarck, they're sending the plans half completed. They're withholding information. So you have conflict over spheres of influence and these resources. Their alliance breaks down for approximately 1 month. The end of that month, they met in secret. They redrew the spheres of influence. They came to new economic agreements, and their relationship was both stronger and weaker than before. It was stronger in the sense that they decided over the spheres of influence, and their economic agreement was stronger in that the Soviet Union was sending much more through to Germany than it was before. It was weaker in the way that now Hitler knew that he could no longer depend on the Soviet Union. He knew that Stalin was going to use this against him, and he started to think he needed to invade much sooner. So it left a lasting damage to their alliance. So that's August of 1940. Secret meeting, redraw. We're going to discuss that because we understand that that's 2018. And I want us to actually break down what this pact, what happened there, and how we see it repeated. What I want us to see is with Poland. Poland began the war, World War II, on what front? The Western Front. Barbarossa, the war on what front? the Eastern Front. And this is why it's painful to watch the news. Because you turn on the news and what do you see day after day? Trump attacking NATO, the EU, the United Nations, all of his former allies. He's attacking the FBI, attacking Congress. He's attacking everything that should be his allies. He's part of the West, but he's waging a war on the Western Front. Can we see that? That this actually begins before the Eastern. And that's what we've been seeing since his election in 2016. First of all, war on the Western Front. From 2016 and his election, he's waging war on the West. And then we understand there's a point in time that we usually mark as raffia when we describe war in the Eastern Front. Did those fronts look that different? No, there's some change in scenery. Are they using different weapons? No. There's some changes in geography and tactics, but by and large they look the same. I want us to look at 2016. The other reason I like considering World War II is that it shows us what we're expecting to see. When we go into history, we hear described a battle and it's a one-day affair because it happened maybe 2,500 years ago. And when we go back into that history, you see 1 or 2 days, a big battle, everything kind of happens at once, and then they divide and there's a winner and a loser. I think World War II gives us a much better modern day application as to what it looks like. And what's the difference here? The difference is, if you were to mark this as 2016 and war on the Western Front, is that while this is a battle, it never ends. It's an invasion that goes on all day, every day. And there's other battles in that history and other events, but it's not a one-day affair. It's much more drawn out. And we see that particularly when we come to August of 1940. It's one battle in this history, but its whole story is much bigger than one day. And it's going to be the same thing with raffia. It's going to start before, you see it ascending, then you can mark events, but then it's going to go on every day. It shows us that it's more than a one-day story, and that's one of the reasons it's important to follow the news, is because when you see something happen with Saudi Arabia, or with Syria, or with Yemen, this is where the war's being fought out. So you are watching war on the Western Front. You are watching this play out between North and South. So I want us to consider particularly the Battle of Ipsus. That requires us to go back into our knowledge of Pyrrhus. If we were to go back into our knowledge of Pyrrhus, what verse did we introduce his history in? Where do we find his history encapsulated? Daniel 8, and there's 2. It's Daniel 8:8. And Daniel 11:4. We'll go to verse 4. Daniel 11, verse 4. Daniel 11, verse 4. Daniel 11:4 says, "And when he shall stand up," who's he? Alexander the Great. So when Alexander the Great stands up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided towards the 4 winds of heaven, Who are the four winds of heaven? Four generals, Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus and Ptolemy. And not to his posterity, not to his children, not according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. So it's not going to go to his family line, it's going to go to his generals. And what Daniel does is he takes if this is what Daniel's done, he's taken the death of Alexander the Great, that's 323 BC. So, if we were to go to 8:8, it's going to use, just go to Daniel 8:8 quickly. So there's a great horn. The great horn is Alexander the Great. When the he-goat waxed very great, when he was strong, the great horn or Alexander was broken, he died. And for it came up four notable ones towards the four winds of heaven. So here it uses the description of horns. There's a great horn that's broken, and that's Alexander at his death in 323 BC. And then when this is broken, how many come up? Four. Historically, is that how it happens? No. What happens at the death of Alexander? So there's many generals. There's many generals. They fight how many wars? They fight 4 wars known as the Diadochi Wars. These are the Diadochi Wars. The first 2 get rid of most of the generals. It deals with most of them. For the third and the fourth, what issue do you have? You have our 4 generals. Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus and Ptolemy. What's the relationship between them? The third and the fourth war, they're in an alliance against who? Their last great threat, Antigonus. So for the third and the fourth Diadochi War, our 4 famous generals combined, the strength of all 4 of them united was only equal to that of Antigonus. That's how powerful he was. So the third Diadochi War ends in a peace treaty because neither side can fully defeat the other. And then they come back together in the fourth. They finally meet the end of the fourth war in 301 BC at the Battle of Ipsus. And what happens to Antigonus? He's killed. And you have the division into 4. What Daniel does is he takes the death of Alexander and the Battle of Ipsus and he calls all the middle of it noise. All of this becomes irrelevant. He just wants this and then he brings them together. And there's actually a quote of the pioneers, if I can find it. Just going to see if I... I want us to see, this is a quote, 1897. Alexander stood up and ruled with great dominion. His genius seemed to promise the realization of his great scheme of consolidating the East and the West. But at the height of his power he died in Babylon. His posterity and all of the royal house perished in the intrigues that followed. Antigonus, the commander-in-chief of the tried to reunite the satraps and thus to continue as one the empire that had passed from Babylon to Medo-Persia and then to Greece. What they're saying what they're saying here is that the work of Alexander was to unite East and West. That was what he wanted to do. He dies, it's all divided, and then what is Antigonus doing? He's trying to reunite East and West. But Ptolemy, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Cassander combined came against him. And Antigonus fell at 301 BC at the Battle of Ipsus in Phrygia. This decided the final breakup of the empire. It had been divided to the four winds of heaven. When was it divided to the four winds of heaven? 301, not 323. And why can Daniel do this? Because what is Antigonus doing? He's doing the exact same thing as Alexander. In this sense, they're the same person. Alexander was uniting East and West. Antigonus was uniting East and West. His empire covered much of the same territory as Alexander. But these four generals kill Antigonus, and when they do that, it's forever broken. It can never be reunited. East and West can never be reunited. And you have the four horns. So Daniel ignores all of this history of the first and the second and the third and fourth Diadochi Wars. He sees what I would like to suggest. He takes it as a parable, skips out the noise, and sees cause and effect. I just want us to look at how we use parables briefly. Go to Matthew 13. Matthew 13, verse 24. I'm going to say that this is the model of farming. This is all about how to farm. If you're farming, there's a man. Verse 24. Another parable put he forth unto them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man which sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat, and went his way. But when the blade was sprung up and brought forth fruit, then appeared the tares also. So the servants of the householder came and said unto him, Sir, didst not thou sow good seed in thy field? From whence then hath it tares? He said unto them, An enemy hath done this. The servants said unto him, Wilt thou then that we go and gather them up? But he said, Nay, lest while ye gather up the tares, ye root up also the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And in the time of harvest I will say to the reapers, Gather ye together first the tares, and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. So we have a story about farming. There's a man, he's going to sow this seed, and what's going to come up? There's going to be wheat, and there's going to be tares. Who's the farmer? Who does Ellen White says the farmer is in this parable? Who sows? She says that this is God. He sows the seed, and up comes a crop, but you also get weeds. Can we see that? Go to Mark 4:26. Mark 4:26. And he said, So is the kingdom of God, as if a man should cast seed into the ground, and should sleep and rise night and day, and the seed should spring and grow up, he knoweth not how. For the earth bringeth forth fruit of herself, first the blade, then the ear, then after that the full corn in the ear. But when the fruit is brought forth, immediately he putteth in the sickle, because the harvest is come. So you have two stories of farming. They're identical. You have a farmer, he throws a seed into the ground, the rain waters it, it comes up. You know farming, you're going to have your crop and you're going to have weeds. The story itself is identical. Who is the farmer here? Verse 7. What does the farmer do? The farmer goes to sleep. Does God sleep? He rises night and day. He looks after this field. The seed should spring forth and grow up. Does the farmer know how it does that? He has no idea how it's growing. Can this be God? God knows how that crop grows. Man does not. So this is a story about us. We can sow. We have no idea how that grows. It's out of our control. There's still a seed. There's still wheat. If you've ever seen a field pre-Monsanto days that didn't have weeds? Really? I want to know how you farm. You didn't. No, you gave me hope for my gardening skills. Maybe I'm just doing it all wrong. This story is not before the fall.
I know. That's the only place.
Are they even in this story? If we're going to, if Jesus is pointing to a field and telling them that, are there weeds?
Yeah.
There's the same weeds here that they are here. What's he saying? He's saying it's irrelevant, it's noise. What I want us to see is that when we come to the Battle of Ipsus, the way we treat that battle is the exact same way that we treat any parable. Some parts of it are relevant for this story, some parts of it are relevant for this story. But there's also information that in the thread of the perspective from which we're choosing to see it becomes irrelevant. It becomes noise. So from this perspective, the weeds are not part of this story. It's noise. It's irrelevant. For this story, they are. For this story, the man is God. For this story, the farmer is us. It's a person. So from one perspective of Ipsus, Seleucus can be the king of the north, and from another perspective, Seleucus can be a branch of the US government. We're not treating Ipsus in any different way than you would a parable in the New Testament. So if we break down Ipsus, there's been 22 years of conflict. Our four famous generals, most of them, aren't even the most powerful or influential generals at the death of Alexander. Cassander's just a nobody. His father was great. He was nobody. Seleucus wasn't that important. They weren't that significant. There was much more powerful generals, including Antigonus, in this history. But they managed to survive, or they managed to defeat the others, or sometimes the really powerful ones just kill each other off. And it's these four that are left, united against one common threat, and that is Antigonus. So when we come to the Battle of Ipsus, and we have to bring Pyrrhus into this story, you have Antigonus and his son, Demetrius. Facing off in battle, Cassander, Lysimachus, and Seleucus. What happened to Ptolemy? Never showed up. From this perspective, he's irrelevant. He never turned up to the battle. He's in union with these three. He hears a false report that the battle was already lost to them, and he flees back to Egypt to make sure his own territory is safe. So Ptolemy isn't part of this battle. Who's supporting Demetrius?
His father. Pyrrhus.
This is Pyrrhus. And in the story that we draw out with Pyrrhus in Macedonia, who's Demetrius? The king of the north. So Antigonus was the 5th general, the most powerful since Alexander the Great. The name Antigonus means like or compared to the ancestor. What was Antigonus doing? Uniting East and West. The last hope of unifying East and West. This was like or compared to which ancestor? Alexander the Great. So you can, like Daniel did, cut out this history because it's the same work, whether it's Alexander or Antigonus. They're the same person. What does Demetrius mean? He comes from the goddess Demeter, the goddess of corn and harvest. And Pyrrhus, he's the king of the south. His name means flame red. Don't know whether people have considered why there's Red Square and Red October and red everything when it comes to the Soviet Union. So Antigonus is like or compared to the ancestor. Demetrius comes from Demeter, means harvest. And Demetrius is supported in this battle by Pyrrhus. So what happens in this battle? Seleucus turns up at the last minute and he's able to drive 400 to 500 war elephants. The exact number isn't known. He's just returned from his campaign east, and he drives them between Antigonus and Demetrius. They cut Antigonus off and then they wear him down until he's killed. In a previous battle, Antigonus had lost an eye. So he was known to have quite a fearsome appearance. He scared people. He was known as Antigonus Monothalmus, or Antigonus the One-Eyed. So in a previous battle, he's born with 2, he loses one eye. In the Battle of Ipsus, he loses the other. I want us to consider application. Are Antigonus and Demetrius fighting each other? In the 2016 election, was Clinton and Trump fighting each other? Yes? What did Clinton want that Trump had? What did Clinton want that Trump had? Trump didn't have the presidency. What does he have that she wants? She doesn't want Cambridge Analytica. In the 2016 election, what does he have that she wants?
Putin's here.
She doesn't want Putin. She hates Putin. They're arch enemies. What does Clinton have that Trump wants? Nothing. There's absolutely nothing that Clinton has that Trump wants. And there's absolutely nothing that Trump has that Clinton wants. She doesn't want Trump Tower. She doesn't want his golf courses. What do they both want? Does Trump have the presidency at this point? No. Does Clinton have the presidency? No. So they're fighting for something separate to themselves. They're fighting for control of the 3 branches of the US government. But from this perspective, they are not fighting each other. They're fighting each other because there's something that they want, but the other person doesn't have it. So Antigonus is Hillary Clinton. She's like or compared to the ancestor. Who is she compared to? Bill's not her ancestor, he's her husband.
The whole swamp.
The whole swamp? That's Trump talk. Why are we using Trump talk? We should be saying that she wants that whole beautiful field over there, the whole rainforest. What ancestor? What about the ones that wrote the Constitution? If we're going to go back to Alexander the Great, who unified East and West? Who brought unity? That ship that protected and defended the people from 1798, that's the ancestor she stands for. That protected and defended the people. This is George Washington. This is those original founders that wrote the Constitution. That's who she stands with. She's like or compared to the ancestor, and she was uniting that empire. And so was Obama. If we look into what Obama did, we should consider the Iran deal. Even the way he handled Russia. He held the world back from the brink of war.